The power failed at exactly 4:12 p.m. 1 second, the foyer was bathed in the harsh, promising glow of test bulbs. The next, I was standing in a silence so heavy it felt like it might crush my ribs. 48 hours. That was all I had before the investors arrived to decide if my career was worth salvaging. I stood, frozen in the dark. Then a beam of light sliced the dust, sharp and deliberate. Heavy boots hit the floorboards, followed by the metallic jingle of a tool belt that sounded less like equipment and more like a warning. "Breaker's shot," a voice said from behind the beam. Jacks. If the lights didn't turn on, I lost the contract. If I looked too long at the woman saving my project, I'd lose my composure. This renovation was a gut job in the dead of winter, which meant the townhouse held the cold like a grudge. The air smelled of wet sawdust, old plaster, and the specific, acrid anxiety of a deadline breathing down my neck. I stood by the unfinished staircase, clutching my clipboard against my chest like a shield. Under my heavy wool coat, I was sweating. Under the tailored blazer, my skin felt too tight, the ink on my wrist, usually hidden, always private, itching against the fabric. I'd spent 10 years building a reputation as the project lead who didn't flinch, who didn't make mistakes, and who certainly didn't get distracted by the crew. Then Jax walked in. She didn't announce herself, she just occupied the space. She was the master electrician the agency had sent over as a last-minute sub, and she moved through the chaotic skeleton of the room with an irritatingly grounded calm. She wasn't deferential. She didn't apologize for the noise or the dust. She just set up her ladder and started stripping wire with a rhythm that sounded like a heartbeat. Snip, twist, pull. "You put the sconces too high," she said, not looking down from the ceiling. Her voice was low, rough around the edges, like unfinished wood. I stepped forward, my boots clicking sharply on the subfloor. "They're exactly where the blueprints say they should be, 66 inches on center. Blueprints are wrong." She finally looked down. The beam of her headlamp caught my eyes, blinding me for a second. Unless your investors are giants, the light's going to hit them right in the forehead. It's unflattering. You want warm, not interrogation. She descended the ladder, one rung at a time. The movement was fluid, efficient. She wore canvas work pants that had seen better days, and a thermal shirt that clung to shoulders broad enough to carry the weight of this entire disaster. I watched her hands. They were covered in drywall dust, fingers thick and capable, manipulating the wire strippers with a dexterity that made my own hands feel uselessly manicured. "The specs are approved," I said, though my voice lacked the snap I intended. "We don't have time to move them." Jax wiped her hands on her thighs, a puff of white dust rising into the cold air. She stepped into my personal space, just close enough that I could smell the ozone scent of copper and the faint woodsy tang of cedar. "I can move them in an hour. Or you can leave them, and your investors can squint through the walkthrough. Your call, Julia." She used my first name. Not Ms. Vance, not Project Lead, just Julia. It felt like a finger tracing the line of my jaw. The conflict of interest clause in my contract was clear. No fraternizing, no side deals, no blurring the lines. But standing there, watching the way her gaze lingered on my face, unflinching, assessing, I felt the lines blurring all on their own. "Do it," I said, turning back to my clipboard to hide the flush rising in my cheeks. "But if we miss the inspection window because you're rewiring the hallway, it's on you." "It won't be." She turned back to the wall, the tension in her back visible even through her layers. "I don't miss." We worked in silence after that. The sun went down early, the winter light fading into a bruised purple through the plastic sheeting on the windows. The only sounds were the wind rattling the loose frames and the steady, rhythmic snip, twist, pull of Jax working behind me. It wasn't a peaceful silence. It was charged, heavy with the things we weren't saying, vibrating with a voltage that had nowhere to go. I checked my watch, but I wasn't reading the time. I was just listening to the sound of her breathing in the dark. Most job sites have a specific, predictable rhythm. It's usually a chaotic, noisy mess of shouting drywallers and plumbers cursing at pipes that won't fit, a cacophony of drills and radios blasting 3 different stations. You learn to tune it out. You focus on the run, the conduit, the math. But this townhouse was different. It was quiet. Too quiet. And in the center of that silence stood Julia. I've worked for plenty of project managers who treat a renovation like a personal insult. They yell, they throw clipboards, they blame the Sparky when the architect drew a wall where a window should be. Julia didn't yell. She vibrated. From the top of my 12-foot ladder, I had a vantage point she probably didn't account for. I could see the way her shoulders were pulled up so tight they had to hurt, the wool of her coat straining slightly across her back. I could see the way she checked her phone every 30 seconds, not reading the screen, just lighting it up like she needed to remind herself the world was still turning outside these unfinished walls. My hands were cramping. The cold in this place was seep into your bones deep, the kind that makes the insulation on the Romex stiff and hard to strip. My knuckles were raw, covered in gray dust and tiny nicks from the metal junction boxes. I flexed my fingers, feeling the familiar burn in the tendons. I liked the ache, though. There's a satisfaction to this work that people like Julia probably don't get. You run the line, you make the connection, and the power flows. It's binary. It works or it doesn't. There's no gray area, no negotiation with investors, no maybe. It's honest work in a dishonest city. But watching her pace the floorboards below me, the sharp click-clack of her boots echoing off the bare studs, I realized she wasn't looking for a binary solution. She was looking for a miracle. And I was starting to want to give her one. It wasn't just that she was beautiful, though she was. Sharp cheekbones, eyes that looked dark and dangerous when she was angry, that tailored coat that probably cost more than my truck. It was the resistance I could feel coming off her. In electrical terms, resistance creates heat, and Julia was running hot. Every time I came down the ladder to grab a different gauge of wire or swap a tool, the air between us felt dense, charged. I saw her slip when she thought I wasn't looking. She leaned against the rough framing of the door, eyes closed, and let out a breath that shook. Her hand went to her left wrist, rubbing the skin under her cuff in a rhythmic, soothing motion. It was a crack in the porcelain, a fault line. I wondered what kind of pressure it took to make a woman like that look so fragile when she thought she was alone. I knew the risks. I've seen crews fall apart because someone couldn't keep their hands to themselves. I needed this paycheck. I needed the reference for the next commercial bid. But logic was having a hard time competing with the pull I felt every time she looked up at me. It was like finding a live wire you didn't expect, a sudden, sharp awareness that makes your heart stutter. The sun had fully set now. The other subs, the plumbers, the HVAC guys, had packed up their vans and rolled out an hour ago. The silence in the house deepened, becoming intimate and heavy. I should have left. I had a cold beer and a warm dog waiting for me at home. But I didn't pack up. I stayed on my ladder, twisting wire nuts, listening to the cadence of her heels on the floor, waiting to see if the circuit would hold or if we were both about to overload the system. The silence of a construction site after the crew leaves is a specific, heavy thing. It isn't peaceful. It's expectant. The dust settles in the beams of the streetlights, filtering through the plastic sheeting on the windows, turning the room into a hazy, underwater version of itself. I was alone, or I thought I was. The hum of the city outside felt miles away, muffled by the layers of brick and insulation we'd spent weeks installing. Inside my head, though, the noise was deafening. My pulse was a steady, distracting thrum against my collar. If this walkthrough didn't go perfectly, if the lighting wasn't exquisite, if the finish wasn't flawless, the consequences would dismantle my reputation with the same casual efficiency Jax used to strip a wire. I wandered into what would eventually be the kitchen. Right now, it was a cavern of plywood and exposed plumbing, centered around a solitary, dust-coated island. I needed caffeine. My hands were shaking, just a tremor, fine and persistent, as I messed with the cheap plastic coffee maker someone had left on a sawhorse. I pressed the button. Nothing. I pressed it again, harder, as if force could substitute for functionality. I was about to shake the damn thing when a light played across the floorboards. "It helps if you plug it in," Jack said. I jumped, spinning around. She was leaning against the doorframe, holding 2 paper cups from the bodega on the corner. The steam rising from them curled into the cold air. "I knew that," I lied, smoothing my coat. "I was just testing the mechanism." "Right, testing the wireless power transmission. Very advanced." She walked over, the floorboards groaning softly under her boots, and held out one of the cups. "Here, it's sludge, but it's hot sludge." I took it. Our fingers brushed, just the briefest contact of skin against skin, and I felt that jolt again. Not static, something deeper. A current that had nothing to do with the wiring and everything to do with the sudden proximity of her body in the cold room. "Thank you." We sat on the floor, backs against the island, legs stretched out into the dark. It was absurd. I was wearing a suit that required dry cleaning. She was covered in the debris of the day, but the exhaustion made the floor feel like a luxury. "Why do you do it?" she asked after a long silence. She wasn't looking at me. She was watching the steam rise from her cup, her profile sharp against the shadows. "The money," I said automatically. "Bullshit. You don't ulcer yourself over lighting placement for the money. You can get paid for mediocrity. You're chasing something else." I took a sip. The coffee was terrible, burnt and overly sweet, but it tasted like a lifeline. "I like taking things that are broken and making them work," I admitted, the truth slipping out before I could check it. "I like the order of it. Chaos in, structure out." Jax turned her head, looking at me properly. Her eyes were dark, intelligent, seeing too much. "Chaos in, structure out," she repeated. "Is that what you are? Structure?" "Someone has to be. Structures crack if they're too rigid, Julia." She shifted, bringing her hand up to gesture, and my eyes dropped to it. Her hands were fascinating. They were rough, scarred with tiny white lines from slips of a screwdriver or jagged metal. The nails short and clean, but stained with the gray dust of the site. They were capable hands. Hands that knew how to fix things, how to connect things, how to make the power flow where it was supposed to go. I looked at her wrist, thick and strong, and felt a sudden, dizzying urge to know what those rough fingers would feel like against the sensitive skin of my own wrist, right over the pulse that was currently hammering a frantic rhythm against my cuff. "I don't crack," I said softly. Jack smiled then. It wasn't her usual smirk. It was genuine, a slow unfurling that changed her whole face. "Everyone cracks. That's how the light gets in, right? Or is that just something people say to make the broken parts feel better?" I laughed. It was a startled, rusty sound, surprising us both. "I think that's a song lyric, actually." "Even better," she chuckled, low and warm. The sound of our laughter mixed in the empty room, bouncing off the bare studs. It felt dangerous. Professional tension is a safe, predictable wall. Shared laughter is a door left wide open. And sitting there in the dark, smelling the cheap roast of the coffee and the cedar scent of her skin, I was terrifyingly, recklessly close to walking right through it. By morning, the atmosphere in the townhouse had shifted from construction dust to something that felt dangerously like static electricity. It was palpable. Every time Julia walked past me in the narrow hallway, the air compressed, a physical pressure that made the hair on my arms stand up. We were dancing around each other, a choreography of avoidance that felt more intimate than if we'd actually collided. I've always been aware of my size. I'm broad-shouldered, tall, built to pull heavy cable and carry ladders. I take up space, and I stopped apologizing for it a long time ago. My body is a tool, a solid thing that gets the job done. But watching Julia, I saw the opposite. She was constantly making herself smaller. She crossed her arms tight over her chest to narrow her silhouette. She tucked her elbows in. She stood with her feet close together like she was trying to occupy the absolute minimum amount of square footage allowed by physics. It bothered me. I wanted to tell her to expand. I wanted to tell her she was allowed to exist in 3 dimensions without apologizing for the room she took up. "We have a problem in the pantry," I said, finding her near the stairs. She looked up, eyes wide, that permanent line of worry etched between her brows. "What now?" "Load-bearing stud pinched the conduit. I can't fish the wire through. I have to go into the chase to clear it." "I'm coming with you," she said immediately, clipping her pen to her clipboard. "It's tight, Julia. And dirty. I need to see the structural integrity if you're cutting near a load-bearing beam. I'm not staying behind." I didn't argue. I just led her to the access panel. The crawl space was a narrow gap between the original brick exterior and the new framing. It was dark, smelling of century-old mortar, dry rot, and cold earth. I went in first, the beam of my headlamp cutting through the gloom. Julia followed. It wasn't just tight. It was intimate by necessity. Once we were inside, there was nowhere to go. The space forced us together. To reach the pinched conduit, I had to twist my body, wedging my shoulder against the brick. Julia slid in beside me to inspect the stud, and suddenly, there was no air left in the room. Her shoulder pressed against mine. It wasn't a brush. It was a solid, continuous point of contact. I could feel the heat of her body through the layers of her clothes, a radiating warmth that defied the winter draft. In the dark, the professional armor she wore, the blazer, the clipboard, the title, didn't matter. It was just heat and breath. I stopped moving. I had the wire strippers in my hand, but I couldn't lift them. The smell of her perfume, something subtle, like jasmine and rain, was overwhelming in the stagnant air, mixing with the scent of cedar shavings and the sharp metallic tang of ozone from my tools. Is it bad?" she whispered. Her voice was shaky, breathless. "No," I said, my voice dropping an octave, rasping in the quiet. "It's just a pinch. I can fix it." I turned my head. Her face was inches from mine in the shadows. I could see the pulse jumping in her neck, a frantic flutter against pale skin. I could see the dust motes dancing in the beam of light between us. The urge to reach out was a physical ache in my chest. I wanted to put my hand on her waist, to steady her, to tell her that she didn't have to hold herself so tightly together. I wanted to be the ground wire for all that tension she was carrying, to let it run through me until she was steady. "Jax," she breathed. It wasn't a question. It was a plea. The line was right there, visible, glowing, dangerous. If I crossed it, the whole project could blow. But God, I wanted to. I wanted to bridge the gap and let the current run. Instead, I gritted my teeth and turned back to the wall, forcing my hands to stay on the copper. "Hold the light," I said, my voice rough. "I need both hands." We scrambled out a minute later, coughing, covered in cobwebs and gray dust. We stood in the pantry, brushing ourselves off, neither of us looking at the other. The air was still vibrating, the connection untested but undeniably live. The 24-hour mark collided with us. The pressure inside the townhouse was no longer atmospheric. It was hydraulic, crushing everything in its path. My head was splitting. A migraine had taken up residence behind my left eye, a sharp, pulsing reminder that I hadn't slept in 2 days. Downstairs, a tile saw shrieked. A high-pitched scream scraped directly against my raw nerves. I stormed out of the office. The flooring subcontractor was cutting porcelain in the hallway, sending clouds of white dust into the air I was trying to keep clean. "I told you to cut outside," I snapped, my voice cracking. "Do you have any idea how hard it is to clean that dust out of the grain? Get it out, now." The man looked up, startled. The room went dead silent. I saw the shock in his eyes. then the resentment. But I didn't stay to manage it. I couldn't. My hands were trembling so violently I had to clench them into fists. I turned on my heel and marched up the stairs, my breath coming in short, sharp hitches that hurt my chest. I retreated to the master bath. It was the only room with a lock. I slammed it shut and leaned back against it, sliding down until I hit the cold subfloor. The panic was a rising, choking tide. I couldn't breathe. I was the project lead. I was the one who handled crises. I wasn't the one who hid in the bathroom because a saw was too loud. The handle turned. I froze. "Julia," Jax pushed the door open gently, nudging my shoulder. I scrambled up, wiping my face, trying to reassemble the mask of competence. "I'm fine," I said, the words brittle. "Just checking the grout." Jax didn't buy it. She stepped inside and closed the door. The sudden quiet was jarring. She stood there, a solid, dark shape in her work clothes, smelling of sawdust and calm. "You're redlining," she said. Her voice wasn't accusatory. It was a factual observation. "You're pushing too much voltage through a system that's not rated for it." "I have to finish," I whispered, the fight draining out. "If it's not perfect, it is perfect. Now you're just hunting for ghosts." She took a step closer. "You need to ground yourself." "I don't know how." The admission was terrifying. I'd never said that out loud. Jax looked at me with that dark gaze that seemed to strip away the blazer. "It's like finding a ground fault," she said softly. "You have to stop the current before you can fix the wire." She reached out. I flinched instinctively, but she didn't pull back. She placed her hand on my shoulder. It was heavy. Her palm was rough, warm, and solid. She didn't squeeze. She just held me there. The weight of her hand traveled down my arm, settling into my bones. "Breathe," she commanded gently. I inhaled. The scent of her, cedar, ozone, sweat, filled my lungs. My jaw unclenched for the first time in hours. The sharp pain behind my eye began to dull. "You're okay," she murmured, her thumb brushing the fabric of my jacket, a tiny, repetitive motion that felt electric. "You're doing a good job. You're just human." I looked up at her. It wasn't just relief. It was the terrifying realization that the dizziness was gone. Here, in a half-finished bathroom with a woman I wasn't supposed to touch, my hands had finally stopped shaking. The professional distance I relied on felt like a joke. The real conflict was between the person I was supposed to be and the person who wanted to lean forward and bury her face in the crook of this electrician's neck. "Thank you," I breathed. "Don't thank me," she said, her voice dropping to a rumble. "Just stop vibrating. You're making me nervous." She smiled, a small, crooked thing, and the tension in the room shifted from panic to something warmer, heavier, and infinitely more dangerous. I stayed frozen under her hand, terrified that if I moved, the circuit would break, and I'd be left in the dark again. 2 a.m. is a strange time. The city outside had finally given up and gone to sleep, leaving the townhouse wrapped in a silence that felt less like a deadline and more like a secret. The crew was gone. The investors were sleeping in their high-rise condos. It was just us, the dust, and the circuits. We were in the main parlor. This was the showpiece room. 12-foot ceilings, original crown molding we'd spent days fishing wire behind, and a chandelier that cost more than my first car. I stood at the wall bank, my hand hovering over the master dimmer. Julia stood in the center of the room. She'd finally taken off that armor-like coat, leaving her in a silk blouse that caught the shadows. She looked exhausted, but in the way a statue looks tired. Permanent, elegant, enduring. "Okay," I said, my voice sounding too loud in the empty room. "Zone 1, main overheads. Fade rate set to 3 seconds." I slid the paddle up. The light didn't snap on. It bloomed. Warm, golden light, 2,700 Kelvin, washed over the walls, softening the hard edges of the construction, turning the raw plaster into something that looked like home. It caught Julia, turning her skin the color of honey. She looked up at the fixture, her throat exposed, and I forgot to breathe. "It's soft," she said, turning to look at me. Her eyes were dark pools reflecting the filaments. "That's the point. It's not about illumination. It's about mood. You want them to fall in love with the house, not inspect the drywall seams." She walked toward me, slow, deliberate steps that ate up the distance between us. "How does it work? The fading?" "Resistance," I said. I kept my hand on the switch, grounding myself. "You hold back the power, and it creates heat instead of light. That's why the switch plate feels warm." She stopped 3 feet away. "Holding back the power creates heat," she repeated. She wasn't looking at the switch. She was looking at my mouth. "Yeah," I rasped. "You have to control the intensity." "And you're good at control, Jax?" "I have to be." I leaned back against the wall, crossing my arms to keep from reaching out. My ex, Sarah, she used to say I treated relationships like wiring diagrams, wanted everything grounded, everything labeled. She hated that I couldn't just let things spark. I dropped the name deliberately. Sarah. It was a test, a flare sent up in the dark to see if she'd run or return fire. Julia didn't blink. She didn't retreat. She took another step, invading my personal space, bringing that scent of rain and expensive perfume right into my lungs. "Maybe Sarah didn't understand that sparks are dangerous," she said softly. "Maybe she didn't appreciate that you were trying to keep the house from burning down." The air between us was so thick you could have cut it with a linesman plier. The rules were abstract concepts in a file cabinet somewhere across town. The reality was the heat radiating off her body, the way her breath hitched when I shifted my weight. "I need the screwdriver," I said, the words purely mechanical, an excuse to break the stare. "For the faceplate." It was on the floor between us. She crouched down, retrieving it, and when she stood up, she didn't toss it. She held it out. I reached for it, my fingers wrapped around the handle, brushing against hers. We both froze. Her skin was electric, a live current that shot straight up my arm and settled heavy in my chest. Her fingers lingered on the metal, trapping my hand. I could feel the tremor in her, the vibration of a system under immense pressure. I wanted to pull her in and see if the resistance would finally give way to the heat we were both generating. "Jax," she whispered. Then she blinked, the spell shattering. She pulled her hand back as if burned, clutching it to her chest. "The inspection," she said, her voice jagged. "It's in 6 hours. We should finish the checklist." She turned away, walking fast toward the kitchen, putting the length of the room between us. I stood there in the warm, golden light, holding the screwdriver, my hand still burning from the contact, watching her retreat from the fire we'd just started. The morning light wasn't the warm, forgiving glow Jax had engineered the night before. It was harsh, gray, and interrogation bright, streaming through the uncurtained windows to expose every microscopic flaw we might have missed. The investors arrived at 9 sharp. They were a phalanx of charcoal suits and skepticism, led by a man named Sterling, who wore a watch that cost more than my car and smelled of expensive cologne and judgment. I was vibrating. The migraine had receded, but it left behind a brittle, crystalline focus that felt like it might shatter if someone tapped it too hard. I walked them through the foyer, my voice steady, reciting the specs I'd memorized weeks ago. Italian marble, custom milled molding, Lutron Homeworks integration. They nodded, their faces impassive masks of calculation. They moved through the rooms like wolves testing a fence line for weakness. Across the parlor, Jax was packing up her gear. Technically, the site was supposed to be clear of subcontractors, but she had stayed behind to check a final faceplate. She shouldn't have been there. Yet, seeing her broad back in that worn thermal shirt was the only thing keeping my heart rate below stroke levels. She looked up as we entered, her eyes locked onto mine over the heads of the suits. It was a brief connection, a grounding wire in the storm. She gave me a microscopic nod, "You've got this," and went back to her work. We moved into the dining room. This was the critical space. Sterling stopped in the center, looking up at the chandelier we had agonized over. "It hangs low," he muttered, frowning. "Feels intrusive. I don't like it." "It's set to the standard height for a table of this scale," I said, stepping forward to demonstrate the clearance. 30 inches above the surface creates an intimate dining experience without obstructing sightlines. I raised my arm to gesture at the fixture's drop. As I did, the cuff of my blazer caught on my watch. The silk of my blouse rode up. For a split second, the black geometric lines of the tattoo on my inner wrist, a stylized mountain range I'd gotten after coming out, a symbol of a climb I was still making, were exposed against my pale skin. Sterling's eyes dropped instantly. He saw it. His lip curled, not in disgust, but in a polite, corporate disdain that was somehow worse. "Interesting," he drawled, the word dripping with condescension. "I didn't realize we were aiming for such an alternative aesthetic. One hopes the workmanship is more disciplined than the personal presentation. We pay for professionalism, Ms. Vance, not rough edges." The shame was hot and immediate. It spiked in my chest, flushing my neck. I froze, my arms still raised, feeling like a child caught breaking a rule. I opened my mouth to apologize, to pull my sleeve down, to retreat into the deference he expected. "Actually," a rough voice cut through the room. Jack stepped forward. She didn't look at me. She stared directly at Sterling. She didn't look like a subordinate. She looked like she owned the building and was just letting him visit. "The suspension height is calculated based on the refraction index of the crystals," Jack said, her voice calm and authoritative, wielding the technical jargon like a weapon. "It maximizes the lumen spread without creating glare on the table surface. If you raise it 3 inches, you get hard shadows on the plates. It's not an aesthetic choice. It's physics." Ms. Vance insisted on the optimal throw to ensure the lighting makes the food, and the guests, look expensive. "Unless you want shadows on your dinner?" Sterling blinked. The technical confidence threw him off balance. He looked from Jax to the light, then back to me. The power dynamic shifted. Jax hadn't just defended the light. She had defended my competence. She had reframed my decision as expertise, not error. "No." Sterling cleared his throat, adjusting his tie. "No shadows. Good attention to detail." He turned and walked into the kitchen. The pack followed. I stood there for a second, breathless, looking at Jax. She didn't smile. She just winked, a quick conspiratorial flicker, and turned back to her tool bag. The rest of the walkthrough was a blur. They signed the papers, they shook my hand, they left. The heavy front door clicked shut, sealing out the wolves. The silence rushed back in, but this time it didn't feel heavy. It felt empty. I leaned against the wall, my knees suddenly turning to water as the adrenaline crashed. I had won. The contract was safe, but looking around the perfect, cold room, the victory felt hollow. I didn't care about the investors. I realized, with a jolt that terrified me, that I only cared about the electrician who was currently loading her truck outside. I pushed off the wall and ran to the window, watching Jax's taillights, praying she hadn't left me alone with the success I thought I wanted. We were celebrating a 6-figure contract victory with $20 worth of lukewarm pad thai on the floor of the finished living room. It felt like a desecration of the space in the best possible way. The Italian marble tiles we had worried over were now hosting plastic takeout containers, and the air, usually smelling of dust and stress, was thick with the scent of lemongrass and chili. The house was done. The lights were perfect, my lights, casting that warm, golden glow that made everything look expensive and soft. But I wasn't looking at the architecture. I was looking at Julia. She had finally taken off the blazer. That armor she wore like a second skin was folded neatly over a sawhorse in the corner, leaving her in just the silk blouse. She had kicked off her heels, her stockinged feet tucked under her. And for the first time in 3 weeks, she looked less like a corporate entity and more like a woman who was finally exhaling. She was laughing at something I'd said about the plumber's crack, a genuine throat-deep sound that vibrated through the floorboards and settled straight into my chest. I shifted, the hard floor pressing against my hip. I should have been packing up. I should have handed over the final invoice, shaken her hand, and walked out to my truck. That was the protocol. That was the safe, grounded way to handle a job. But gravity was working differently in this room tonight. The pull wasn't coming from the earth. It was coming from the woman sitting 3 feet away, picking at a spring roll. "So," I said, clearing my throat and reaching for the paperwork I'd laid out between us. I needed a prop. I needed something to put between the current running through my veins and the reality of the situation. "We need to go over the final draw. I added the hours for the rewire in the pantry, but I waived the rush fee because I wanted to." Julia didn't look at the paper. She was leaning back on her hands, the silk of her shirt pulling tight across her chest, watching me. Her eyes were dark, heavy-lidded, and focused entirely on my face. There was no professional distance left in that gaze. It was direct. It was hungry. It was the kind of look that strips wire without a tool. "You waived the fee?" she asked softly. "Yeah, call it a professional courtesy." I tapped the paper, trying to draw her eyes down to the numbers, to the safety of math. "And the lighting controls are all set. I programmed the evening scene to fade over 5 seconds. It's smoother." She hummed, a low sound of agreement, but she didn't look down. She just kept watching my mouth move. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was pressurized. It was the feeling of a capacitor charging up, holding more energy than it was rated for, right on the edge of bursting. I looked up, meeting her eyes, and my train of thought derailed completely. The numbers on the page blurred. The speech I had prepared about maintenance schedules evaporated. All I could feel was the heat radiating off her, the absolute, undeniable fact that we were alone in a house we had built together. "Julia," I said, and my voice sounded rough, wrecked. "You need to stop looking at me like that. I can't focus." She didn't blink. She didn't apologize. She didn't retreat into the nervous project manager I'd met 3 weeks ago. Instead, she leaned forward, invading the demilitarized zone between us. "Like what?" she challenged. Her voice was a whisper, but it carried across the quiet room like a shout. "Like, I want to know if you taste like cedar and ozone? Like I'm wondering why you haven't kissed me yet." The air left the room. The blood roared in my ears, loud enough that I was sure she could hear it. The invoice was forgotten. The rules were forgotten. "I'm the electrician," I murmured, the protest weak even to my own ears. "I'm the help." "You're the only real thing in this entire zip code," she countered. I reached out. I couldn't help it. My hand moved on its own, bypassing logic, drawn by the magnetic pull of her presence. My fingers were rough, stained with the ghost of work, calloused and hard. I hesitated for a fraction of a second, giving her the chance to pull away, to remember the investors, to remember the gap between us. She stayed still, breathless. My fingers found her wrist, the left one, the one she had hidden from Sterling. I slid my hand under the cuff of her silk sleeve, pushing the fabric up until the black ink was exposed. The mountain range, the climb. The skin there was impossibly soft, warm, and pulsing with a rapid, heavy beat that matched my own. I didn't just touch her. I traced her. I ran the pad of my thumb along the sharp, geometric line of the tattoo, following the ink like a circuit trace. It was a reclamation. I was erasing the shame Sterling had tried to put there, replacing it with something else. Reverence. "He was wrong," I whispered, my eyes tracking the movement of my thumb against her skin. "This isn't a flaw. It's the best part of the design." Julia let out a shuddering breath, her head falling back slightly, her eyes fluttering shut. "Jax." "I'm here." I slid my hand up her arm, feeling the silk give way to the warmth of her skin, my palm cupping her elbow, then her bicep, pulling her gently toward me. She moved like water, fluid and inevitable. When I kissed her, it wasn't frantic. It wasn't the desperate, messy collision of a fling. It was slow. It was heavy. It was the feeling of a circuit finally closing, the arc flash of connection that sears itself into your retinas. Her lips were soft, yielding, tasting of wine and relief. I felt her hands tangle in my hair, pulling me closer, anchoring me to her. The resistance was gone. There was only the flow, hot and overwhelming, washing away the dust, the deadlines, and the rules. I forgot about the invoice. I forgot about the truck parked outside. For the first time in my life, I wasn't worried about the house burning down. I was just happy to be in the fire. Waking up in my own bed felt like returning from a long, high-altitude journey. The light filtering through the blinds of my loft wasn't the harsh, interrogation-grade LED glare of the construction site, nor was it the carefully engineered 2,700 Kelvin warmth Jax had programmed into the townhouse. It was just morning light, gray, soft, and unapologetically real. I lay there for a long time, listening to the hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen and the distant traffic on the avenue, realizing with a slow, dawning wonder that the frantic buzzing inside my own head had finally stopped. I felt rewired. That was the only word for it. For years, I had been operating on a system designed for high voltage and constant output, ignoring the fact that my insulation was stripping away with every deadline. I had treated my body like a container for my stress, something to be tailored, managed, and hidden under layers of wool and silk. But lying under the heavy weight of my duvet, I didn't feel like a project manager or a corporate entity. I felt solid. I felt grounded. I lifted my left arm, turning my wrist to catch the light. The tattoo, the geometric mountain range that Sterling had sneered at, stood out stark and black against my pale skin. Usually, looking at it brought a flash of defensive anxiety, a reminder of the gap between who I was and who the industry wanted me to be. Today, it just looked like ink. I remembered the roughness of Jax's thumb tracing that line, the calloused friction of her skin against mine, and the way she had reclaimed the mark with a single, reverent touch. She hadn't tried to smooth me out or cover me up. She had looked at the rough edges and called them a design feature. The conflict of interest clause in my contract sat in a file on my desk across the room. I looked at the stack of papers, expecting the familiar surge of guilt or professional panic. It didn't come. The words felt toothless now, abstract concepts written by lawyers who had never stood in a cold pantry and felt the terrifying magnetic pull of another person's gravity. The job was done. The wiring was safe. The investors had their perfect, glowing townhouse. The idea that I was supposed to deny the only spark of genuine reality I'd felt in a decade for the sake of optics suddenly seemed laughable. I rolled out of bed, my muscles aching with a pleasant, heavy fatigue that had nothing to do with stress. I made coffee, real coffee, not the bodega sludge we'd bonded over, and stood by the window, watching the city wake up. I felt different in my own skin. Jax had made me feel substantial. She hadn't treated me like I was fragile, even when I was cracking. She had treated me like a system that just needed a better ground connection. My phone buzzed on the counter, vibrating against the granite. My heart did a traitorous little flip, a physical reaction I hadn't authorized but couldn't suppress. I picked it up. Jax. Coffee's better on the east side, but the company isn't as good. Hope you're not vibrating today. You did good, Julia. Simple. Grounded. No flowery declarations, no morning after awkwardness. Just a steady check-in from someone who knew exactly how to read my gauges. I typed a reply, my fingers moving quickly, erasing 3 drafts before settling on the truth. Holding steady, no vibrations. See you at the walkthrough. I showered and dressed, pulling on the same tailored armor I wore every day, the blazer, the boots, the watch. But as I looked in the mirror, fastening the buttons, the woman staring back didn't look like she was hiding anymore. The coat wasn't a shield. It was just clothes. I wasn't walking back into that townhouse as a stressed manager terrified of a slip-up. I was walking back in as the owner of my own desires, fully powered up and ready to handle whatever voltage came next. The final handover is usually my favorite part. It's the moment the chaos resolves into stillness, when the noise of the saws and the shouting subsides into the quiet hum of a functioning system. The townhouse was finished. The floors gleamed under the midday sun. The walls were flawless expanses of cream plaster, and the air smelled of lemon oil and closure. It was perfect. It was cold. It was exactly what I had been hired to create, but standing in the foyer, I felt a strange sense of loss. The house felt empty without the rough, chaotic energy of the work. Jax was waiting by the front door. She had traded the tool belt for a leather jacket, her hair damp and smelling of fresh soap, but she still wore the boots. She still occupied the space with that undeniable physical gravity. "Keys," she said, holding out the brass ring. The metal caught the light. Master set, service entrance, and the code for the panel. I took them. I was careful not to let our fingers linger, careful to maintain the buffer zone that the open front door required. The neighbors were watching. The city was watching. The mask was back on, but the material had changed. It wasn't iron anymore. It was glass, transparent, fragile. "The investors are thrilled," I said. My voice sounded too formal, bouncing off the marble. "Sterling actually asked for your contact info. He wants you on his penthouse renovation." Jax snorted softly, leaning a shoulder against the frame. "I told him I'm booked. I'm picky about my projects, Julia. I don't take a job unless I know the foundation is solid. You can put gold fixtures on a weak frame, but it eventually collapses. I need to know the structure can hold the weight." She looked at me then, her dark eyes steady and unblinking. The subtext was heavy enough to crack the floor tiles. We weren't talking about architecture. We were talking about us. We were talking about the weeks spent testing the resistance, finding the fault lines, and deciding that the friction was worth the risk. "The structure is solid," I replied, holding her gaze. "I checked the load-bearing walls myself. It's rated for high voltage." "Good." A slow smile spread across her face. Not the polite smirk she gave the investors, but the private, warm expression she had worn in the dark of the pantry. "Then we're ready for the next phase. You don't rush the rough-in. That's the first rule. You strip the wire clean, check the gauge, and make sure the connection is tight before you ever think about flipping the switch." We spent weeks in the dark, testing the limits, making sure we wouldn't blow the fuse when the real power hit. We built this thing carefully. We built it to last. I used to think safety meant insulation. I thought if I wrapped myself in enough layers, contracts, blazers, rules, I wouldn't get burned. I was terrified of the spark. But Jax taught me that resistance just creates heat. Safety isn't about avoiding the current. It's about knowing how to handle the voltage without shattering. "I have to file the permit closure at the office," I lied, clutching the keys. "I should go." "Yeah, paperwork." Jax pushed off the wall, checking her watch. "I'm heading out too. There's a diner on 4th, 2 blocks over. They have terrible coffee, but the booths are private." "I could go for some terrible coffee," I said. 10 minutes? 10 minutes. I walked to my car, my heels clicking a steady rhythm on the pavement. Behind me, the timer clicked. The townhouse windows flooded with that warm, perfect golden light. Jax's light. It was a flawless execution. I pulled away from the curb and checked the rearview mirror. A beat-up truck pulled out behind me, steady and close, following my lead. The connection held. If you've ever found a spark in the most unexpected place, leave a comment below. Subscribe to follow the rest of their journey.